Imagine you're a backpacker traveling through the beautiful, vast wilderness of Australia. The world is full of possibilities, but as you set up camp near a peaceful national park, a chilling danger lurks in the shadows, one that will claim the lives of young travelers, leaving behind a trail of blood and a killer who remains elusive. This is the story of the Backpacker Murders, one of Australia's most infamous crime sprees that terrorized the nation for years. But what made these crimes so terrifying, and how did the killer evade capture for so long? The mystery of the backpacker. Murders has intrigued not only Australians but people worldwide. The fact that the crimes occurred in some of the most idyllic, tourist-friendly parts of the country created an eerie contrast. This case wasn't just about a killer, it was about a chilling fear that seemed to permeate the wilderness, forever altering the way we think about safety and innocence in the Australian outback. The Australian wilderness and its allure. The Australian outback is not just a physical space. It is an almost mythical environment that attracts travelers from all corners of the world. Known for its vast, rugged beauty and seemingly endless horizons, the outback represents freedom and adventure to those who come to explore it. For backpackers, it's a place to disconnect from the bustle of modern life and immerse oneself in nature. This allure was what drew many of the victims to the area. However, it was precisely this allure of the open road, the isolation, and the raw beauty of the wilderness that left many travelers vulnerable. The terrain is remote and difficult to navigate, which made it the perfect hunting ground for a killer who knew the land intimately. For the victims, the promise of adventure would soon turn into a horrifying nightmare. The outback was no longer just a destination for exploration, but became a place of unimaginable fear. The victims. Innocence. Lost when we think of the backpacker murders, it's important to remember the victims. These weren't just nameless statistics in a crime story. They were young people, often far from home, in the prime of their lives, eager to experience the world. Caroline Clark and Joanne Walters, two British backpackers, were among the first to disappear in 1990. Their fates set off the chilling chain of events that would unfold. The loss of young travelers from other parts of the world, like Germany's Anja Habschied and Gabor Neugebauer, or the tragic deaths of others who were yet to be found, sent shockwaves through the global community. For many, it served as a cautionary tale about the dangers lurking beyond the postcard-perfect view of Australia. These murders not only left an indelible mark on their families, but also served as a tragic reminder of the risks faced by those who ventured into unfamiliar lands. For the families and friends of the victims, the mystery surrounding the deaths would haunt them forever, with their grief compounded by the years of uncertainty. A series of unexplained disappearances. The first victims, Clark and Walters, vanished in the New South Wales area, a region often frequented by tourists. Their disappearance was initially brushed off as another unfortunate incident in the unpredictable life of a backpacker. Many people were quick to chalk it up to the usual dangers of the road, hitchhiking, remote camping, or simply falling prey to the unpredictable nature of the outback. However, as other backpackers went missing or were found, brutally murdered, it became clear that these weren't isolated incidents. These young women weren't just part of a statistic of the backpacker lifestyle. They were victims of a calculated, horrific crime. The increasing number of disappearances painted a chilling picture that would soon lead to the realization that the killer was targeting a specific group of people, travelers who trusted the open road, but whose trust would soon be betrayed. The evidence. What was left behind? The first major clue came when the bodies of Clark and Walters were discovered in a remote area near Belanglo State Forest, which would become infamously linked to the murders. The remains were badly decomposed, complicating the task of identifying the cause of death. Early forensic examination showed signs of sexual assault and brutal violence, suggesting that these murders weren't crimes of opportunity, but carefully planned and executed. As more bodies were discovered, each revealing similar signs of torture and violent death. It became evident that this was the work of a serial killer, someone who was not acting out of impulsive rage but out of calculated desire. The evidence at each crime scene became increasingly chilling as investigators pieced together the puzzle. The sheer brutality and the methodical nature of the killings painted a portrait of a killer who thrived on power and control over his victims, leaving investigators to confront the terrifying reality of a serial predator hiding in plain sight. The killer's modus operandi. Striking in the Outback, a hallmark of a serial killer's behavior is their consistency in how they choose and kill their victims. In the case of the backpacker murders, the killer exhibited a distinct modus operandi. Victims were often backpackers traveling alone or in pairs, and they were typically hitchhiking, a common practice for travelers in Australia. The killer preyed on their vulnerability, offering them rides and luring them to secluded areas where he could overpower them. Milat's choice of victims, young, inexperienced backpackers, was not random. It reflected a deep understanding of the area and its landscape, coupled with the knowledge that such isolated settings would provide ample opportunity to strike without being detected. Milat, as authorities later discovered, had a connection to the terrain. His knowledge of the land made him a ghost in the wilderness, able to elude authorities while his victims suffered unimaginable horrors. Police investigations. The early days of the hunt in the beginning, authorities struggled to make the connection between the various murders. The remote locations of the crime scenes and the lack of solid evidence caused many to treat the deaths as isolated, unrelated events. This initial lack of coordination between law enforcement agencies was a major hindrance, as police were unable to recognize the emerging pattern. The forensic clues that changed everything. The case broke open with the discovery of the body of German backpacker Anja Habschied in 1991. Her body showed signs of similar violence to previous victims, which allowed detectives to finally connect the dots. Forensic evidence, including hair and fibers, linked her death to the earlier killings. This was the turning point in the investigation. From this point on, police began to focus their efforts on identifying a suspect who was familiar with the outback and the backpacking lifestyle. Milat became a person of interest after it was discovered that he had been in the areas where some of the bodies had been found, and his criminal history raised red flags. This was the moment when the investigation started to gain real momentum. The rise of a suspect. Ivan Milat's connection. Ivan Milat, a 47-year-old man with a history of violence, was arrested in 1992. Milat had long been under suspicion, but it wasn't until investigators pieced together evidence from various sources that they were able to build a case against him. His connection to the area and his criminal background made him an obvious suspect. What made Milat particularly chilling was his ability to blend into society. He was a man who, on the surface, seemed normal, working in various blue-collar jobs, living a relatively mundane life, but beneath the facade he was capable of horrific acts. His arrest shocked many who had known him, as the man behind the killings was not some stranger or outsider, but someone who had quietly slipped through the cracks of society. The arrest and investigation. Milat's dark past, Milat's arrest, did not come as a complete surprise. His history of violence, including accusations of sexual assault and intimidation, painted a picture of someone who could easily be capable of the gruesome murders. In fact, the more investigators dug into his past, the more disturbing details emerged. Milat had a history of violent behavior dating back to his youth. He had been known for his temper and had a fascination with weapons. He was also an expert in the terrain of the outback, a trait that allowed him to commit these heinous acts with an almost predatory precision. The police found that he had been in the areas where many of the victims had last been seen. His dark past and knowledge of the land made him the perfect candidate for the role of the backpacker killer. The trial. Unraveling the mystery of Milat's actions. The trial of Ivan Milat captivated Australia and the world. As the evidence mounted against him, it became clear that he had committed a series of murders with chilling consistency. His methodical planning, the brutality of his actions, and the lack of remorse were all key factors in his conviction. For many, the trial also raised deeper questions about the nature of evil. How could someone like Milat, who blended in with everyday life, harbor such violent tendencies? The trial provided a window into the mind of a killer who was cold, calculating, and willing to take the lives of young travelers without remorse. The conviction. Milat's guilt. Established, Milat's conviction was a turning point in the case. After years of searching for answers, the authorities had finally captured the man responsible for the backpacker murders. In 1996, he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. His conviction brought a sense of justice to the families of the victims, but the horrors of the crimes lingered. For many, Milat's sentence was a bittersweet victory. While justice had been served, the victims' lives could never be replaced, and the psychological scars left on their families and the Australian public would remain forever. The legacy of the backpacker murders would continue to haunt those affected by the crimes for years to come. A legacy of fear. How the murders shaped Australian society. The backpacker murders had a profound effect on Australian society. The once open and welcoming outback, a place where travelers could roam freely, became a symbol of fear. The psychological impact on Australians was immense, and many people began to view the outback as a place of danger rather than adventure. For backpackers, it served as a chilling reminder that even the most beautiful places could hold the darkest of secrets. The murders altered the way people approached their travels in Australia, making them more cautious and aware of their surroundings. In a sense, Milat had not just stolen the lives of his victims, but he had also stolen the innocence of the Australian wilderness. Milat's prison years. A killer behind bars. In prison, Milat's behavior continued to be disturbing. He remained defiant and refused to admit guilt, even as the overwhelming evidence pointed to him as the murderer. His behavior was a reflection of his refusal to accept responsibility for his actions, and he continued to manipulate and control situations even behind bars. Milat's time in prison was marked by violent outbursts, and he often sought attention from the media, trying to maintain his notoriety. His inability to admit guilt and his continued attempts to control the narrative around his case demonstrated the level of narcissism and arrogance that had fueled his crimes. Theories and speculations. Did Milat have an accomplice? While Milat was convicted of 7 murders, some speculated that he may have had an accomplice, or that there were other victims who had never been found. Some of the victims' bodies were discovered in areas that suggested the involvement of another person, and the level of organization and coordination in the killings raised questions. However, no concrete evidence has ever emerged to support the theory of an accomplice. Milat's sole responsibility for the murders has been firmly established, and investigators have closed the case on the idea of additional perpetrators. Nonetheless, the possibility remains in the minds of some, adding an extra layer of intrigue to the case. The continuing mystery. Other suspects and unsolved cases. Despite Milat's conviction, there are still lingering questions about whether he was the only killer operating during this time. Some investigators have suggested that Milat may have been involved in other unsolved murders or disappearances in Australia, and that the true scale of his crimes may never be fully known. The backpacker murders case remains a subject of debate and investigation, with some theorists wondering whether other killers might have been active in the same areas during the same period. This mystery continues to haunt both investigators and the public. Impact on law enforcement. Changes in police procedure. The backpacker murders had a lasting impact on law enforcement in Australia. The case highlighted the importance of using modern forensic techniques such as DNA analysis and more sophisticated investigative tools to track and capture serial killers. Police also began to rethink how they investigated murders in rural or remote areas, learning from the mistakes made during the initial stages of the backpacker murders case. In many ways, the case reshaped how law enforcement viewed serial crimes. The need for interagency cooperation and more modern approaches to crime solving became evident, leading to significant changes in policing techniques across Australia. The backpacker murders in popular culture. The story of the backpacker murders has become part of the fabric of Australian crime history. Documentaries, films, and books have been created to explore the case in greater detail, with many focusing on the psychological profile of Milat and the investigation into his crimes. In popular culture, the case has been used as a reference for how serial killers operate, and it continues to serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers that can lurk beneath the surface of seemingly peaceful landscapes. The image of Milat as a cold, calculated killer is one that continues to haunt the collective imagination of the public. The backpacker murders stand as one of the darkest chapters in Australia's criminal history. While justice was eventually served, the deep psychological scars left by Milat's actions cannot be erased. The murders serve as a stark reminder of the evil that can lurk in the most unsuspecting places. Even today, the story of Ivan Milat remains a chilling part of the public's understanding of serial crime. As new generations of travelers continue to visit the Australian outback, they are reminded that, though the danger has passed, the specter of the backpacker murders remains an indelible part of the country's history. The discovery of the Belanglo Forest mass grave in 1993. The discovery of a mass grave in Belanglo State Forest became one of the most harrowing moments in the investigation. When the police uncovered the remains of several victims in shallow graves, it was clear that the killer had not only been active for years, but had methodically hidden his victims in the heart of the Australian wilderness. The forest was dark, dense, and remote, an environment that made it almost impossible for anyone to stumble upon these bodies unless they knew exactly where to look. The gruesome nature of the find also hinted at the psychological profile of the killer. Belanglo Forest, known for its isolation, served as the perfect location for someone who wanted to conceal their crimes. The fact that the victims' bodies were often disposed of in such a clandestine manner suggested that the killer had a deep desire to remain undetected, a desire that would fuel his actions until his eventual capture. The mind of a killer. Milat's psychological profile. Understanding the mind of a serial killer can be both fascinating and terrifying. Ivan Milat's psychological profile was examined by experts who described him as having a personality marked by narcissism, an obsession with power, and a deep-seated hatred toward women. These traits manifested in the brutal way he hunted, controlled, and disposed of his victims. Milat appeared to enjoy the power dynamics between himself and his victims, and his violence was calculated and controlled. Moreover, Milat's seemingly ordinary life masked the monstrous tendencies beneath. He was a man who, despite being highly dysfunctional and violent, blended into society. His ability to keep up the facade of an average man in his community played a key role in his evasion of suspicion for so long. The psychology behind his ability to carry out such heinous acts while maintaining an outwardly normal persona continues to intrigue criminologists. Milat's family background. A troubled upbringing. Milat's troubled family background is crucial in understanding the possible factors that led him to become a serial killer. He grew up in a large, dysfunctional family with an abusive father. Milat's violent tendencies were evident early on, as he exhibited behavior that was marked by aggression, cruelty, and a lack of empathy. His upbringing did little to provide the emotional support and guidance needed for healthy psychological development. The Milat family was described by some as being a toxic environment, where cruelty and violence were normalized. Ivan's relationship with his siblings was marked by animosity, and his father's abusive behavior undoubtedly played a role in shaping Milat's worldview. Many experts believe that this environment, combined with Milat's inherent personality traits, contributed to his eventual violent actions. The role of media coverage. Sensationalism versus fact. The media coverage of the backpacker murders case was intense, and it played a significant role in shaping public perceptions of the crime spree. The Australian public was gripped by the sensational details of the murders, as the media painted a terrifying picture of a cold-blooded serial killer on the loose. The widespread media coverage created an atmosphere of fear and paranoia, where every backpacker was seen as a potential target. At the same time, however, the media also added layers of distortion to the case. Sensationalism often overshadowed fact, leading to false leads and misplaced public fears. The constant media coverage of Milat's crimes and trial made it easy for misconceptions to spread, as rumors and theories flooded the public discourse. In the end, while the media helped keep the case in the public eye, it also muddied the waters of true investigative work. Public fear and the impact on tourism. The backpacker murders had a direct impact on tourism in Australia, especially backpackers, who relied on hitchhiking and camping to explore the country. Australia had long been known for its open and free-spirited tourism culture, but after the murders, many travelers began to rethink their safety. Fear spread quickly across the backpacker community, with people rethinking their itineraries, questioning the safety of remote areas, and opting for safer, more tourist-friendly options. The Australian tourism industry was forced to make changes in response to the public outcry. Authorities started to issue safety warnings, advising travelers to avoid certain areas, particularly the outback and Belanglo State Forest. Tour operators. They also began to implement new security measures to ensure the safety of their guests, signaling a shift in how the country was perceived as a safe travel destination. The media's obsession with Milat. The notoriety of the backpacker killer. Milat's arrest and subsequent trial drew widespread media attention, turning him into a notorious figure in Australia's criminal history. This created a complex relationship between the public and the media, as many felt that the media's obsession with Milat's life and actions was unhealthy. While the public had a right to know about the investigation and trial, some argued that sensationalized portrayals of Milat's personality and background were distracting from the true nature of the crime. Milat, who was already narcissistic and attention-seeking, often relished the media spotlight, providing more fuel for the public's curiosity about him. His interviews and court appearances, in which he exhibited no remorse or empathy for his victims, only further cemented his reputation as one of the most frightening criminals in Australian history. The long road to justice. The emotional toll on families. For the families of the victims, the journey to justice was long and agonizing. Many parents and loved ones had to endure years of not knowing the fate of their children. The frustration of unanswered questions, combined with the pain of loss, created a cycle of grief and uncertainty. When the bodies of the victims were finally discovered, it brought closure to the families, but that closure came with the heavy weight of knowing the horrific details of their loved ones' final moments. For the families who had to endure the media frenzy and public speculation, the emotional toll was even greater. While some welcomed the media attention as a way to keep the case alive, others felt that their personal pain was being exploited for public consumption. In the end, the emotional scars left by the backpacker murders were not limited to the victims. Their families carried them for the rest of their lives. Milat's continued denial. The monster who would not admit guilt. Even after his conviction, Milat refused to take responsibility for his actions. He remained defiant, never showing any remorse for the murders he had committed. Throughout his trial and imprisonment, Milat maintained his innocence, a stance that bewildered both his prosecutors and the families of his victims. His complete refusal to admit guilt, despite the overwhelming evidence, highlighted his lack of empathy and inability to accept responsibility for the destruction he had caused. This denial added an extra layer of cruelty to his character. It wasn't just the murders themselves that made Milat terrifying. It was the cold, calculated manner in which he continued to live in denial, attempting to manipulate and control the narrative even after being caught. His actions left a trail of grief and suffering, but his refusal to acknowledge this only served to deepen the pain for those who had been affected by his crimes. The evolution of the case. New evidence and cold case investigations. Though Milat was convicted, the case continues to captivate investigators, journalists, and criminologists. With new advances in forensic science and investigative techniques, some believe there may still be additional evidence or connections that could shed light on the full scope of Milat's criminal activity. The ongoing fascination with the backpacker murders has led to a continued investigation into Milat's life and other potential crimes he may have committed. Although the case is officially closed, there is always a lingering curiosity. Was Milat responsible for other unsolved cases, and could there be more victims whose names have never been written in the history books? The unsolved victims. Other possible murders. Attributed to Milat as investigators comb through old cases. Questions arise about whether Milat was involved in other murders, particularly those of missing backpackers and travelers during the same time period. While Milat was convicted of 7 murders, there are still several other disappearances that remain unsolved, and some theorists suggest that these could have been Milat's victims as well. The mystery surrounding the true extent of Milat's crimes adds an unsettling layer to the case. Did Milat stop killing after his conviction, or was he merely the tip of a much larger iceberg of violence? This uncertainty will likely continue to haunt both law enforcement and the public for years to come. The backpacker murder's impact on serial killer profiling. The case of the backpacker murders had a lasting impact on the development of criminal profiling techniques. It was one of the first cases in Australia where the use of psychological profiling played a major role in narrowing down potential suspects. Milat's background and behavior closely matched the profile of a serial killer, and this helped investigators focus their efforts on finding a suspect who fit that profile. The case also demonstrated the limitations of early criminal profiling techniques, as it took investigators years to connect the dots and realize they were dealing with a serial killer. Nonetheless, the case provided key insights into the characteristics and behaviors of serial offenders, and it has since become a reference point in the study of criminal psychology and profiling. The Long Shadow of Ivan Milat. A monster in the outback. Even though Ivan Milat is now behind bars, his legacy looms large over the Australian outback. The backpacker murders remain one of the most infamous cases in the country's history, and the fear that accompanied Milat's reign of terror still lingers in the minds of many. Tourists, backpackers, and locals alike still remember the stories of Milat's horrifying crimes, and his name has become synonymous with the fear of the unknown dangers lurking in the vast wilderness. The psychological impact of his crimes has left scars not only on the victims' families, but also on Australian society as a whole. For many, the haunting image of the backpacker killer continues to define the dark side of Australia's outback, forever tainting the image of the country's wilderness as a place of adventure and freedom. Conclusion: a dark chapter in Australia's history. The backpacker murders are a dark chapter in Australia's history, one that has shaped the national consciousness and altered the way we think about crime in rural areas. Ivan Milat's gruesome actions and his chilling manipulation of his victims will never be forgotten. His case serves as a painful reminder of the evil that can exist behind an ordinary facade. While justice has been served, the emotional scars remain, both for the families of the victims and for the Australian public. The story of the backpacker. Murders continues to haunt us. A chilling tale of deception, brutality, and a man who lived a lie until the very end.